Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, I bid everybody a happy Sunday. I hope everybody is having a nice day of rest. Very beautiful day where I reside. Very beautiful day indeed. So today we are going to continue our ongoing conversations, our ongoing analysis of the war between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States, and the Ukraine against the Russian Federation. Now, normally I do a intro based on the war between the Ukraine and the Russian Federation, but we have to accept the fact that NATO, the United States, are direct participants in this conflict. Right now, as we speak, there are ongoing discussions on whether these missiles, these Storm Shadow, low observable missile systems, and in all probability other missile systems that may not necessarily be open sourced, are being used against the Russians. And now there's talk about lobbing these missiles towards Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the reason that these conversations are coming up in regards to the Ukrainian leadership wanting to use these missile systems against the Russian Federation, against targets in Moscow, outside of Moscow, targets possibly in the direction of even St. Petersburg, is the fact that the Kursk incursion has failed. The Russians have stopped the Ukrainians from a movement towards Kursk, the city Kursk proper, and the E38 highway to the north. At the same time, the Russians are continuing this very methodical drive towards Procross. And once Procross falls, this key transportation hub will no longer be in the possession of Ukrainian military forces. The Russians will have a wide range of options once Procross falls. And I've talked about this before. So Procross is on the verge of falling. The Russians will then pivot to the north and to the south, enveloping Ukrainian forces. At the same time, discussions are underway with unknown persons in the White House. Guys, you have to accept the fact that Joseph Biden is no longer cognitive. He has been on vacation the last 17, 18 days, I believe it is now. Joseph Biden is no longer running the country and has not been running the country in all probability since day one. What concerns me for the American people is that whatever group is now running the country is perfectly okay with the understanding that the American people do not know who is running the country. And right now, unfortunately, the American people are accepting it. The American people, at least the supporters of the unitary one-party state based around the Democrats, the Democrat Party, is putting a person who has never been elected to office, who during her early campaign for the office of president never received an electoral vote, who was at one point, I believe, around 3%. 3% of the Democrats in the Democratic primary were going to vote for her. 3%. And now this person is the leading candidate for the quote-unquote office of the president. But again, please understand, this is now rapidly becoming, or has become, under the Democrats, a figurehead position. A figurehead position. So as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization continues to provide Storm Shadow missiles, and the authorization of use for Storm Shadow missiles against targets around Moscow are approved, because again, look, the Ukrainians are in a desperate situation right now. The Donbass front is collapsing. The Russians have achieved a breakthrough and are expanding its area of control day in and day out. Let's go over to the where you, the viewer, can see kind of what is happening over the course of just the last 10 days or so. So again, this is the Procross Front. This is the area that the Russians are driving toward, this key transportation hub. And if we just go back in time, again, this is a Ukrainian-supported site, by the way. So you can see just what exactly is happening. And this is just in August. Zoom in a little more here, and then fast forward. So the Ukrainians are getting desperate. I mean, desperate times call for desperate measures. The first measure was the Kursk incursion. Again, it didn't work. If we go back and we kind of look at what has happened, not much in the way of territory being taken by the Ukrainians. It's a border area largely made up of fields and some forests, fields and forests, with one minor border town known as Sudzha. And that is what has been taken by the Ukrainians. The Russian blocking formations are in place, and the Russians will probably start to systematically destroy Ukrainian forces in this salient that the Ukrainians have created. But again, what is going to happen if and when the Ukrainians, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, starts to lob cruise missiles, low observable cruise missiles, deep inside of Russia? How will the Russians respond? What will happen? These missiles, these Ukrainian Storm Shadows that are being used, are being stored in Poland and Romania. When they want to use these weapon systems, they are then transported across the border into the Ukraine. It's also very, very likely that Ukrainian aircraft are actually taking off armed from Poland, from Romania. They do a brief touchdown inside of the Ukraine, and then take off again after being refueled, possibly even not being refueled, and then launch the missiles towards the Russian Federation. Now, what if the Russians respond to that? I would imagine that if under the same scenario, this was happening to say the United States, the United States would respond. Let's say, for instance, that in Afghanistan, while U.S. forces were in Afghanistan, Iranian aircraft were taking off and being used against U.S. forces. We would destroy, in all probability, both the aircraft and the airbase in which Iran was launching said mission. So within the context of this conflict, you cannot rule out the possibility that Russia responds, especially if NATO weapon systems are used against Moscow, targets in Moscow. If a low observable, very advanced NATO weapon system is used against Moscow, the Russians are probably going to respond. Now, what does that response look like? Is it a strike against a quote-unquote NATO territory, a NATO member state? Possibly. Then what? Then what happens? The outcome of this conflict is more increasingly likely that the Russians believe that the only path forward is to bring about the complete destruction of the current Ukrainian state in its current form. The Ukrainians right now are talking about possessing about 80 F-16s. 80 F-16s at some point. Now, the defense industry, both here in the United States and the EU, is going to provide the Ukrainians with vast amounts of weapon systems. So the only way to really repay for the purchase of those weapon systems is going to be through resources and territory. And eventually, the Ukrainians aren't going to possess those resources and territory, especially in the east. The coal, the iron, what NATO is looking at right now, wanting to possess, they're not going to possess it because the Russians are going to conquer it. Now, compounding that, again, is going to be this forward-looking idea that the Ukraine is going to be this very well-armed proxy state. All the Russians are going to accept that. Even if Ukraine doesn't join NATO, even hypothetically, if it doesn't join the EU, whatever is left of Western Ukraine, will Russia accept having a very well-armed NATO proxy state setting on its border? Again, I go back to the 1980s. If the Soviet Union could look into a crystal ball and see what was happening now, I very much doubt the Soviet Union would have dissolved. I can't imagine that happening. Now look, NATO, the United States, Western Europe has put itself in this position. It did not have to go east into the Ukraine and try to gain control, which it is. Didn't have to do that. None of this would be happening right now. But it is. So again, if and when these missiles start flying towards Moscow, what's going to happen? There is no leadership in the U.S. White House right now. We don't know who is leading the country, and that is an absolute fact. Again, the most important issue, at least here for the United States, the people in the United States, is we are accepting this. We are accepting not knowing who is running the country. And that's terrifying. We are right now on the precipice, on the verge of global war. And it's hardly being discussed, and we don't know who is leading the country into this abyss. More to come. As always, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.